The material world is a really fascinating one because let's just say there are two shops, and shop A has all the materials you know. So I don't know what you're wearing today, but I'm going to guess it's some kind of cotton and polyester blend. Both of those things will be, right? And that's easy to buy, and we can find it anywhere. And we can kind of go to shop A, and shop A has all the cottons and polyesters and all the fibers we've been used to for the last, cotton certainly, 5,000 years, polyester, let's say sort of like 100-ish. I'll give you a really specific example to illustrate it. We created a jacket called the Martian Aerogel jacket. Now, if you've watched the last landings of the Mars rovers, you will have seen a giant parachute unfurl over the Mars rover. It's broken through the atmosphere and it's about to land. Now, that parachute, I believe I'm correct in saying that the rover's moving, I can't remember the exact thing, it might be 16,000 miles an hour. It's certainly moving max 16, I think it's moving at. And then it has to get down to about 230 kilometers an hour, something like that. And it has to do that in about 2 seconds. So the braking power of that parachute has to be just off the scale. It has to be the strongest parachute ever built. And so I looked at that and thought, oh, we could make a jacket out of that. That would be good. Combine exotic material with A and exotic material B, C, D, E, F, and suddenly you get into Iron Man stage. I think that's where it's going to get really fun. I think we're going to move not commercial clothing instantly, as it's going to be a journey. That's where it'll move. We'll move out of kind of, your cotton and polyester blend. I mean, mine's made with graphene, but it's still got polyester base with elastane. I think we're going to emerge. Timescales up to debate, but we're going to emerge into an era of metamaterials, and I think that will define clothing. Obviously, it will just be wildly expensive at first, but there'll be people who want it.
So let's start at the beginning. How would you like to define yourself for people first time listening to you? Who is Steve? You have a twin brother.
I do. So I operate as one half of a pair. And to anyone wondering, we are definitely telepathic. And I mean that very, very truthfully, we are. What am I? I love creating the future. So I'm someone who thinks very deeply about what the future is going to hold and then tries to reverse engineer stuff for it. That's what I'm fundamentally fascinated by. So when I watch a sci-fi film like Dune, which I love, I instantly start thinking, well, those clothes are props. How do you make them real? That's just how I'm wired. Or when I watched the last James Bond, where he had all the kind of little robots crawling all over his skin, I start thinking, well, what would a good version of that look like? How could you use robotics in a good way? And so that's just how I'm wired. And so I would define myself as a creative who's fundamentally interested in creating the future. And my chosen vehicle right now is clothing. However, I think that is going to branch out very significantly because what clothing is going to become is fundamentally set to change. And so it's not like, oh, I really like designing pretty shirts. It's probably going to become a lot more complex than that relatively quickly, I think, over the next 10 years. That's what I am.
But I'm curious, when did you thought about Vollebak to start in 2015? Can you tell me of the story that you decided to do that?
Yeah, so I started after university. Well, at university I studied art history. I was very interested in how the world is shaped, and art, while it looks separate to the world, is actually a really good sort of indicator of power structures. And so I really enjoyed looking at how those sort of power structures develop and how people use art as basically as a tool of war and influence, which I found really, really fascinating. And so the natural progression was to go into advertising, because that's the same. I mean, it's a tool of war and influence, where you're kind of shaping what people think. But ultimately, while that was a great training ground, I think what it's a great training ground for is having lots of ideas and being prepared to throw 99% of them in the bin. And I think that's why it's such an interesting training ground, as so many people emerge from it and go into other industries, which they then go on to do very well in, because you just get used to just churning out ideas. And I think creativity is fundamentally, there's a lot of it that's about volume. So this is all about insight as well. But like, the more ideas you have, just the better chance you have of coming up with something good and being able to, we call it, so like, it's called turning the page. So you have an idea, that idea dies for whatever reason. The speed at which you can turn the page and have your next idea and your next idea, I think that has a really profound impact on creativity. So that's what advertising was really good for. And then my brother and I were running various sort of like really tough races around the world, like ultra marathons in really extreme places. And we were working a lot on Adidas at the time, so working a lot on sports stuff. And there was no like single light bulb moment, but there were a series of moments where a light bulb sort of emerged and sort of got a little bit brighter above our heads. And one of those was simply, we were out doing some very extreme things in some very extreme places, and our clothes, which are the only things we really had on us, were of no assistance at all. And actually, we could have done that race 100 years before, or 100 years before that, or 100 years before that, and it wouldn't really have made any difference. And so I remember thinking, it didn't help light us up at night. It didn't help us sleep before the race. It didn't tell us what our heart was doing. It didn't tell us when we were under pressure. And so if you think about the body as basically this great big ball of data that is constantly spitting data off, none of it was being used. None of it was being processed. None of it was being used to enhance. And I just remember thinking, wow, clothes are really stupid. That was it. Just clothes are stupid. Because they're dead and they're stupid. And then I got to thinking sort of slowly over time, well, that's probably not the way that they are going to be. Even the sort of early indications was kind of spacesuits. Well, they're kind of, complex, habitats, essentially. And so I thought it was probably a really big gap there between where we are today and where we're going to be. And I sort of, we did our first sort of attempts at clothing. So we started very early while we were still working back in advertising. We created a hoodie. The idea was it should try and relax you. And I'd done a lot of work on, I do yoga and I have done for a very long time. And so I train my parasympathetic nervous system. So I train it to kind of help me relax, essentially. I thought, I wonder if a piece of clothing could do that. And so we worked with color, and we worked with positioning around the nose and mouth. We created a pig noise soundtrack. It was very advertising. It's a pig hoodie that zipped over your face. So it's really crazy. But even in that early example, it kind of gave a really good indication of where we're trying to go, which is think conceptually differently about clothing and ask questions that haven't been asked before. Because in asking those questions, you can't just design a cotton t-shirt or a polyester sweater. You have to design something different. So the very early days of the brand were super experimental. There's a restaurant called El Bulli that I really loved at the time, and we were just like, oh, well, let's do that. Let's just do the craziest stuff we can without any kind of thought about profit or margin or where the company was going. It was really, could we do something interesting? And that's really where it emerged from. Over time, it's taken a different shape, and I now have much more sort of cohesive views about the future. And I feel I understand the industry quite well and where I think it needs to go and how we're going to do that. But at the start, it was just this weird experiment of like, let's just see what happens here. So those are the very origins. So it came from a kind of extreme sports background, a kind of an observation that clothing really hadn't changed in the way, like, imagine cars hadn't changed for 100 years, or rockets or planes. It's like, we didn't even have rockets 100 years ago. And then the clothing hasn't. What's really changed is just the marketing around it. I know we've got certain new types of polyester and certain new types of leather, but it's very, very old in a way. If there were other industries that were essentially trading off 40 to 50-year-old technology, they would get wiped out. Whereas in clothing, it doesn't. And that kind of felt peculiar to me.
I'm curious, what was challenging back then when you started? Since you say that most of the clothes we have are quite stupid and not intelligent, so what was it challenging for you and your brother back then to, and maybe still, I'm not sure if you can tell me about the challenges to get that vision compared to what we have in the market around us from the clothes we have?
Well, there are obviously lots and lots of challenges because the industry is set up in the way it's set up. And if you want to break that, you end up having to break everything. So I'll give you a really silly little example, right? So in about the 1880s, an English guy invented petroleum-based dyes. And this is the thing, one of the main things that, destroys the planet. Petroleum-based dyes are really useless. And before that, humanity was basically very successful at dyeing stuff with non-petroleum-based dyes. And that changed after the 1880s, and you had this chemical revolution. And since then, everything we're wearing is dyed with synthetic petrol-based dyes, pretty much 90+% of it. And even if you try and break that, so we've been trying to break that with various things. So we sort of work with stuff like raw fibers. We've dyed stuff with DNA, where we've kind of literally extracted DNA from plants, and then you basically brew it like beer by injecting it into microorganisms. But then you have to find someone who'll work with you. And the minute you go, okay, we're going to do this novel thing, you have to have partners. Because let's say, unless you've got like $1 billion and you're vertically integrated instantly, well, everything is done through partnerships. You have to find a bunch of people who are prepared to work with you, who are prepared to put, DNA dye in their, dye stock or their dye houses, and that you get lots of people who don't want to do it. And so the fundamental challenge is actually finding partners who are going to enjoy your vision and work with you on it. That's the actual challenge. Now, if cash was no object, if cash was air, this wouldn't be a problem. I'd have all of I'd be like Elon, right? I'd have all these factories. I'd make all my own stuff. But that's actually the challenge, finding people to come on the journey with you. The ideas are not conceptually that difficult. I think we could probably have a good chat now and think about, the 10 next things that will define clothing. That's not really difficult to do. But the gulf between idea and implementation is giant. And that's where it comes in. And I think, what really is coming down the line, and we're working a lot with now, is technology. This thing is hard and this thing is soft. And these two are going to combine, right? And so you're then on a sort of scaling challenge. And so the challenge coming down the line effectively is how does that phone essentially, or the technology inside that phone, or all the kind of the apps, how does that effectively become part of our clothing? I mean, on a long enough time scale, it's all going to be embedded in our brains, right? And we'll be, post-human cyborgs. But that's not immediate. And so the much more likely outcome is that all of that's going to become embedded. And so the challenges around that are profound, because then you have to think, what do you want to do, and how do you embed it, and what is the technology? Whereas the ideas are simple. We could, as I say, we could both think, hey, I want an Iron Man suit that I can fly around the world in. Great. Well, now I need to invent about 500 different technologies. I need to have, materials that are probably a couple of microns thick and bulletproof. I need all of these things. I just go, these are the things I would need to have in order for that to work. Those are the challenges that are coming down the line, which again are going to come down into partnerships. Really, that's where you can't be like a starving artist in a tower working on your own on this. It really is reliant on WhatsApp and communities of innovators around you, and who I'm connected to and who wants to work with us. It's utterly dependent on that. I don't think an industry can be transformed by, some lone genius working on their own. There's no record of it anyway. Well, not for the last few hundred years anyway.
So I'm curious to ask you, in that case, once you have been focusing on many aspects for the future of clothing, like in space and healthcare. I think that's super interesting. Can you tell me about the vision to go for these places that you're trying to solve this problem? And who are the partners that just starting to maybe focusing on shifting the way we imagine clothes? Can you tell me about the evolution to get to these places, healthcare, sustainability?
Yeah, so I really start with there's a guy who backed Elon multiple times, a guy called Steve Jurvetson, who talks about inevitable futures, which is a phrase I really, really like. And so I sort of start from there. And so an inevitable future would be, we're going to go to space, right? So whether you agree with going to space or you don't agree with going to space, humanity's definitely going to carry on going to space, because there's lots of rich people who want to carry on and there's governments who want to do it. So whether you want to talk about it like sort of the colonization of space or the arrival of humanity in space, you can wordsmith it whatever way you want. But basically, we're going to build some stuff on some planets and we're going to live there. Like, that's fairly sort of categorical. So I'm obviously working on that because it's so fundamentally interesting to the future journey of humanity, right? You as a designer, you can't look at that and go, I'm just going to ignore that and carry on making red t-shirts. I think you kind of have a duty to go, well, someone probably has to design some interesting stuff for that. That I'll go into that in more detail in a minute. But alongside that, we are also designing for resource scarcity, because I think you can't sit here as a designer and go, it's all fine, we can use whatever we want, because, well, clearly we can't. There's some quite clear evidence that lots of things are running out on Earth. That's why people are talking about asteroid mining to go and get minerals for our phones, right? So I'm very interested in the space aspect. I'm very interested in the resource scarcity. The other one would be climate. Like, you kind of have to look there. And so the idea that, I mean, I live in England, which basically, it's never ever been hot. Like England, I grew up and it was always raining, and now it's quite hot, and we get floods and we get fires. And so even like there's very, very clear evidence, as just by living as a human being in a country, that's changing. And I think not designing for that is also negligent. And then the fourth one would be health. I think health kind of crosses all of those. And then if you think about like, well, how do we approach that? I mean, I know your field's robotics. I think we probably approach it a bit like engineers. You go, well, what are the challenges? So the first thing I look at is, I go, well, I know that people, sleeping in space is hard, especially on the ISS. You've got 23 sunrises and sunsets a day. Like, humans aren't programmed for that. We're programmed for one sunrise and one sunset a day. So we started working on a sleep suit called a deep sleep cocoon that was based on the exoskeleton of a woodlouse that essentially folds over your head, creating this like very protective environment. We looked at the when you go up in space, it affects different people differently, but your vestibular system gets out of whack and you puke, basically, because your body goes, oh, where's the ground? And the result of, oh, where's the ground, is you throw up. And so we started looking at clothes that had like inbuilt sort of vomit pockets and vomit bags in them. So just like really, like, it seems silly, but really practical stuff. And then I'm lucky enough to have some friends at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and I sort of enjoy chatting to them about various things. And one of the funniest chats I've ever had was about, what if you're allowed to take 3 objects to Mars, what do you take? And he was saying, whether you ask senators or school children, everyone starts off with, oh, they want a laser gun and like a buggy that can drive over Mars. And then they sort of workshop through the day, what are the things you're actually going to need, what it's going to be like when you're up there. And most people, by the end of the day, end up with some kind of version of a photo of their family, a musical instrument, and a home-cooked dinner. Because actually that's what they realize they're going to miss, because it sounds really exciting being on another planet, but also it's absolutely terrifying, I would imagine. Now, obviously, I think they're probably going to get people up there who are less terrified by being on another planet. And so thinking about people are going to miss home, one of the things they're going to miss is very simple, is their bed, right? People are going to miss their bed. Yeah. And so we designed this hoodie that's literally built by a machine that builds beds, that basically creates this sort of 3D printed foam that's incredibly comforting, where you can feel like you're in bed at any time. So these are by no means spacesuits, and I'm not trying to do that, although one day I do hope that we will. But they do think very practically about what are the things we're actually going to face when we're up there. And I do enjoy the psychology of thinking about that. And so, so how we approach it is we take sort of one simple challenge at a time, and then we design stuff for that. And I think that for my belief, that's an interesting approach to design, as opposed to kind of, squirreling away, filing 100 patents, creating a wall garden, never telling anyone what you're doing. That's just not a way I'm particularly keen on designing. I find it more interesting to sort of take on some challenges and see what we throw out.
Mm-hmm. I really like what you say. I think about the way that design, I think when you thought about like sort of experiment, if you go to space, what do you miss? Then you design the clothes within that. I think that's very interesting. I'm curious about the design philosophy at Vollebak and your team, how you come up with such design, and you verify that would be needed. And one of the things I find interesting when you say that the clothes should be like for forever, like immortal, and I was like, this is interesting. I'm not sure, why do you think clothes should be forever? Like, if you have a piece of clothes like 30, 50 years, why it's relevant? Like, someone say, why should have this piece of clothes for 50 years?
Oh, well, I think so. So we've made ranges of clothes that we call 100-year and indestructible, and they're made up of incredibly strong fibers. Typically, they some of them are, incredibly fireproof. They can sort of withstand re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. So some really kind of like extraordinary materials. Many of them built by NASA. So conceptually, I was interested in that because people don't necessarily think about the time span of their clothing. It's quite a invisible subject. It's just like, I've worn that for a while now, and then it goes to the back of a wardrobe, and then eventually it's sent to a charity shop. And people don't think about that life cycle. But the reason I wanted them to think about the life cycle is because the pile of, the clothes mountain that builds from discarded clothing gets bigger and bigger every year. I can't remember. I did worked a statistic on it. I think it's like a garbage truck full of clothing every 1 second. Like, it's just astronomical. And so conceptually, I wanted to sort of get the idea across that you could probably think about your clothing in a different way. There's no reason like that your clothing shouldn't be handed down if it's built well enough. And while everyone's probably got like one item like that in their family, people don't have whole wardrobes. And so conceptually, I found that interesting because it's the utter contrast to fast fashion.
I see what you're trying to do is fashionable and at the same time out of what we know in the clothes industry. I think that's super interesting, the design, and then you verify that will be used for space or sustainability. How you come up with this with the team, like the design and verification. I think that's something very interesting to know, the way you think about the design of the clothes.
Oh, well, here's where we get into UFO world. I run, and my brother does too, and it just arrives fully formed in our heads. So my personal way of coming up with ideas is not chatting to people or sitting down in a room. It's basically changing my mental state and presumably my chemical balance through exercise. That's it. And then I will have a challenge in my head, and then I will solve it while I'm running. And sometimes that can be a kind of an inner monologue, sort of like, floating along like a stream, just sort of meandering through your head. And sometimes it arrives as a kind of like a statement in your head where you go, oh, wow, where did that come from? And so, this kind of thinking and where ideas come from has been, subject to question for thousands of years. The way sort of Socrates and Plato were looking at it. And people have referred to it as the muse, or, in modern UFO world, it's called sort of downloads of kind of its intelligence that's sort of given to you. I tend to use sport to specifically running and specifically in nature and barefoot and sunshine to think about stuff. And the ideas will just tend to arrive in a very uncomplicated fashion. And as I said, the ideas aren't the challenge. The challenge is then the execution. Once you come up with something, and what's interesting is some of the things we're talking about, obviously the clothes we sell today, I've actually spent my last 3 years working on, we've just not unveiled any of it yet, is much more deep-lying technology. Because where we've been, and we're still going to carry on here because I think it's just fascinating, is we're in a world of material science, right? So instead of thinking about sort of plastics and polyester and leather, we think a lot more about stuff like graphene and carbon fiber and Dyneema and PBI and DNA and phosphorescent compounds. So we basically play with a completely different toolbox. But ultimately, where that's going is, I was interested in those materials because they're effectively going to act as a sort of the substrate or operating system for the technology that gets layered on. And we're not going to be laying onto cotton or polyester because it makes no sense. And so, so the simple ideas arrive while I'm running, and then lots of the deeper ideas do too as well, because you're essentially trying to get a neuron to fire here and a neuron to fire there, and this thing you heard a year ago meets this thing you heard yesterday, and they sort of pop together in your head. I've never done drugs, but I think I definitely use exercise as some kind of mental enhancement model.
This is so interesting. I'm just curious about the material, because that's, I think, the most interesting part when you thought about different costs of material. Can you tell me about how easy, and when you look for the material, what available and what do you have to do, come up with new material? I'm not sure. Can you tell me more about this process and how it's aligned with the design to get it to the final shape?
Okay, so the material world is a really fascinating one because let's just say there are two shops, and shop A has all the materials you know. So I don't know what you're wearing today, but I'm going to guess it's some kind of cotton and polyester blend. Both of those things will be, right? And that's easy to buy, and we can find it anywhere. And we can kind of go to shop A, and shop A has all the cottons and polyesters and all the fibers we've been used to for the last, cotton certainly, 5,000 years, polyester, let's say sort of like 100-ish. And that is freely available. It's unbelievably easy to make with. You can find any supplier in the world can get it to you. It's just a commodity. And that shop is really easy to walk into. You can walk in, everything's cheap. It's really easy. Shop B contains all the fun stuff. That contains, as I said, PBI, phosphorescent compounds, DNA, Dyneema. Just even opening that door is hard. It's just really difficult. The door is really big and it's heavy, and there's people guarding it. And even when you get in there, they don't want to sell it to you. I'll give you a really specific example to illustrate it. We created a jacket called the Martian aerogel jacket. Now, if you've watched the last landings of the Mars rovers, you will have seen a giant parachute unfurl over the Mars rover. It's broken through the atmosphere and it's about to land. Now, that parachute, I believe I'm correct in saying that the rover's moving, I can't remember the exact thing, it might be 16,000 miles an hour. It's certainly moving Mach 16, I think it's moving at. And then it has to get down to about 230 kilometers an hour, something like that. And it has to do that in about 2 seconds. So the braking power of that parachute has to be just off the scale. It has to be the strongest parachute ever built. And so I looked at that and thought, oh, we could make a jacket out of that. That would be good. Now, you can't just call up NASA and you go, hey, your parachute, could we have a bit of it, please? Well, first of all, it's on Mars. There's lots of problems with that. The second thing we looked at is the Mars rover was effectively protected by a layer of aerogel, so the world's lightest solid material, in order to stop it freezing or baking or whatever the atmosphere is going to do to it. And so I like the look of the aerogel as well. So you basically have these two technologies designed to land a rover on Mars. And I obviously thought, that would be really good to make a piece of clothing out of, because you've got like a crazy strength parachute, which I thought has to be very light because it's so expensive to send heavy things to space. They're going to have made the parachute really light. I know that the aerogel is stunningly light. Well, what if we could house that aerogel inside that parachute fabric? You should be able to create something that's extraordinarily strong, keeps you unbelievably warm, but is stunningly lightweight. And so that wasn't a particularly complex idea to come up with once I'd seen the Mars rover landing. But then getting access to all of those materials, I mean, it's like saying, I'm just going to follow Alice down the rabbit hole. That'll be easy. It's just so you have to find all of the people. You have to persuade them to work with you. You have to work out, can that even be done in clothing? And then you have to inspire them to say, hey, we're going to test it. We're going to be the first. And so the materials do exist, but there is no route for them to come into clothing. So that's what you have to go and invent. You have to build the relationships, find all of those things. And at the end, it looks nice and easy, and there's a product, and there's a smiling man in a cool jacket. And you go, that's easy. But the steps to go along that process are, I would say, probably in excess of 1,000 times more difficult than walking into shop A, which has all the cottons and polyesters in it. Like, it's so fundamentally challenging. However, the reason it's worth doing is it will change how clothes operate, because someone has to be the first to do that. I mean, I think a really interesting, I don't know if it's a brilliant analogy, but it's certainly an interesting story, is the emergence of electric cars. It's like 150 years old. And I think it's something like in the 1920s, like a third of cars were electric. It's something like absolutely crazy. But there's a difference between the technology. Sometimes the technology is just too early, and you don't have the infrastructure for it, and it's too nascent, and the appetite's not there, and it all died off, and then it's obviously all got brought back. But I think probably what we're doing is the equivalent challenge in the car industry of what happened about sort of 10, 15 years ago with Tesla, where they went, oh, we're just going to do it electric. Probably every process was, I'm not part of it. I don't know this. I know the story, but I'm not part of the company. But I would imagine the whole industry was set up against that, right? From customer, public perception, all the way through to supply chain. I would imagine there wasn't a ready supply chain to serve that market. I think they probably would have had to invent quite a lot of that. Now, ours is obviously, I don't have to build a car. A car might have, tens of thousands of components, say, even a very complicated jacket might have 30. But it's the equivalent exercise in not only having to engineer the idea, but then engineer the entire supply chain to create that idea.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious about the timing. When you say the timing, I think that's something interesting about the product market fit here. When you try to see the people that you already, the science, whatever, can develop such a material and the design. We can't talk about the market itself. What are it selling? Something it's selling and maybe still. And can you talk about how the feedback looks like? Of course, you have already so many reviews for your jacket that the Vollebak, and it's really impressive. But I'm curious to go in the direction and the timing and something new and validating the market fit here.
Yeah. So my idea on market fit is sort of very shaped by my advertising background, which is what you really want is you want a really hardcore group of people who love you. That's what you really want. There's almost nothing worse than being met by apathy or people who go, it's okay. What you really want is kind of a tribe of people who go, yeah, that's me. And that tribe of people, our tribe of people, skews very, very tech and very, very future facing. I mean, the best way to think about it is kind of what are they doing with the rest of their lives? Well, they will definitely be watching every Christopher Nolan film whenever it comes out and every Denis Villeneuve film when it comes out. Probably be wearing an Aura ring, probably be driving a Tesla. So probably looking at ways of extending their life chemically or extending their health chemically. They'll probably be biohacking in some form or another. Probably be taking cold showers every morning. There's a very specific fit with people who are interested in the future, and you tend to find that they're much more united by mindset. One of the things that happens in advertising all the time is people try and get like, what does the customer look like? Oh, well, they're a 17-year-old girl and they shop here and they listen to Taylor Swift, or they're a 45-year-old lawyer who lives in this part of London. And ours isn't like that at all. The people are absolutely united by mindset, and they're very, very future facing. But I know 18-year-olds who are wildly future facing, and I know 80-year-olds who are wildly future facing. So, we were sort of talking before, weren't we, about Jacques Vallée, the technologist, and sort of, I would say, the best UFO researcher in the world. So Jacques is probably, I've not had the good fortune to meet him yet, but he must be one of the most future-facing people on the planet. I'd have to go on Wikipedia to find out how old he is, but he's definitely older than you and me. He's got...
In the 80s.
In the 80s, okay. So he will be super, super future-facing. And so will Elon, but Elon will be, 30, 40 years odd younger. So what we find is that it's really, really, they're united by mindset and they're interested in what's next. And there's an acceptance around what's next involves experimentation and involves trial and error, and it involves doing things that other people aren't doing. And so that's the interesting thing I've found, that you couldn't have written that in a business plan. You could have had a educated guess, but I don't think you could have known that. That's one of the interesting things that's emerged. And so I'm then very fortunate to chat to lots of these people. They are kind enough to reach out, suggest ideas, volunteer some of their technology that they have that they'd like us to introduce. And so there's a wonderful book by a guy called Stephen Johnson called Where Good Ideas Come From. And it basically looks at kind of the pockets of history, like the Renaissance or Enlightenment in London, for instance, or sort of ancient Greece, where a very high proportion of ideas that define the current paradigms we live in were effectively set up by a very small concentration of people in a very specific place at a very specific time. Ours today, we're much more. I work in London, but we're much more informed by the Valley. The Valley is a place in time, right? And so that thinking largely informs how I think about stuff. It's sort of long timelines. It's at scale. It's thinking about how does an industry get reformed. I'm not thinking about, oh, how do you sell the next 10, black t-shirts? Because that's not the challenge I'm going for.
Yeah, I'm curious about the exotic material. Did you know any like material you wish to have but was hard to get?
Oh
That's
yeah.
big. Yeah, right.
Well, yeah, there's all sorts of material. So I mean, the two there's lots. There's some I can talk about. There's some I can't. So I would instantly be interested in having a look at some of the materials that have been classified that have come from we don't know what. I mean, I think there's probably extraordinarily exotic things there in terms of stuff that we know about and isn't sort of buried somewhere. I mean, yeah, I'm drawn to things like Vanta Black and the stuff where you go, oh, how do you do that? But obviously, I'm fairly sure from the stuff I've looked into, it's carcinogenic, so you probably don't want to put it too close to our bodies. Yeah, I'm always looking at what's coming next. In my mind, though, I think it's too reductive to say it's a material. I mean, I think we're going to enter a period of atomic Lego, basically. It's going to be effectively things layered on top of each other where their sort of capabilities become greater than the sum of their parts. And so metamaterials is the thing I'm really interested in, and how quickly that can happen and at what scale it can happen, and how quickly it can get out of the lab and into kind of production, essentially. And so I think probably the things I'm most interested in are like if you combine exotic material with A and exotic material B, C, D, E, F, and suddenly you get into Iron Man stage. I think that's where it's going to get really fun. I think we're going to move not commercial clothing instantly, as it's going to be a journey. That's where it'll move. We'll move out of kind of your cotton and polyester blend. I mean, mine's made with graphene, but it's still got polyester base with elastane. I think we're going to emerge. Timescales up to debate, but we're going to emerge into an era of metamaterials, and I think that will define clothing. Obviously, it will be wildly expensive at first, but there'll be people who want it.
And the cost, by the way, how it looks like the cost in that case, since you're trying to push the limit here, how you manage the trade-off, like something new and the cost.
Well, so very bluntly, I mean, everything's expensive. If you want to break the system and use materials that are very expensive, everything costs a lot of money. It's like super straightforward. That's not even something you can do anything about. That's just it's what you have to work with. You'd have to be at such scale to influence that. I mean, huge. You'd have to be at a scale beyond probably any clothing brand that exists to actually influence the sort of, even the price. I'll give you an example. So we make a jacket called the Full Metal Jacket out of 65% copper. And then over the last, and it's super cool because obviously copper has this, has about a 50 centimeter halo effect where basically sort of pathogens or germs really sort of don't like it and it goes in and punctures their membranes. So it's got super, super cool properties. But then the copper price goes through the roof for various reasons. And then well, okay, cool. That is your supply chain. You can't then go, okay, I'll go and make it out of, leather or whatever. It's made out of 65% copper. So when you make with these materials that are typically used for other industries, you are then subject to all of the, waves of influence that hit those other industries, like raw material pricing. Whereas if you were to make with more conventional materials, I would suspect you would have more stability. So I don't think cotton's about to treble in price, but metal might. And so when you work with metals or graphene, then those are the kind of things you're subject to.
Okay. We are closing to end, and I have a question for you about the materials you choose and the geometry, because also you're pushing towards robotics and this kind of metamaterial as well. So how you decide which factor you need? Like the jacket should be not damaged. That's the biggest objective for us. Do you think sometimes you have to make this trade-off for that, compromise certain things to achieve the goal? Because there's many variants here. You try to think about the material, how the shape looks like, and can you tell me about what is your biggest factor, like not be damaged, for example? Can you tell me how you make this decision to achieve
Yeah,
what you want?
yeah. So we try not to do compromise. I think it's a really terrible thing. So the reason that most brands will compromise, so it tends to be cash, right? It tends to be like you either don't have enough cash or you don't think the customers will pay what you want them to pay for it. So we've never really operated with that as a way of thinking. We've always operated of how do you make this thing absolutely exceptional? And then you go, well, I need material X, I need factory Y, and then we work on it until it's done. Now, what we do work with is you do work with a threshold of risk. So you do work with the thing where you go, well, actually, this has a higher chance of failing before we get to production or during production than if we were to make out of a conventional material. So the compromise or the trade-off we make is around risk. And so let's say, Nate, if you pick another clothing brand, I'm just going to name two random, like Under Armour or Lululemon, right? They'll make out of materials that are, more conventional, easily accessible. The risk profile through their R&D and through their production period will be far, far lower than ours. And so the compromise we make is the compromise is a trade-off, basically. How much risk are we prepared to tolerate? And so that's the thing we have to tolerate. We have to know, a much higher percentage are going to fail, essentially, while we're trying it. The DNA would be an interesting example to use that again. So when, in order to create that color, you are extracting DNA from a plant. You are then effectively injecting it into a microorganism. You're then brewing that microorganism, and at any time, in a different size vat with it subject to different heat, and at any time, just a 1% change somewhere along that chain, and the blue you're dyeing is suddenly completely different. So suddenly, let's for example say you got 1,000 hoodies, and they might be 1,000 different blues, and so any other brand is going to go, right, they go in the bin. Hence the clothes mountain I was talking about earlier. And we don't. We go, well, they're slightly different blues, and then you write on our website, they're slightly different blues because we've made it with DNA. And so those are the things we have to tolerate, I would say. But I wouldn't call them compromises. I would call them, actually, no, maybe they are compromises. So I have to compromise, for instance, on color stability. I have to say color stability is not the thing that's going to define whether people want that or not. Because ultimately it's a blue hoodie. It's not like one's purple and one's white, but there will be variations where if you put them out with your, the naked eye, you can see these things are different.
Mm-hmm. When you have feedback from customers, do you have to change some feature in the design? How it looks like? That's about the feedback. If you can you share it? Yeah.
Okay. Well, so it totally depends what it is. So one of the funny things about creating a brand like ours is because I think we go more sci-fi than any other brand does. You obviously just get asked for crazy stuff. So you'll obviously get feedback. It's like, oh, my hoodie's the wrong size. Can I change it? But you will also get plenty of feedback of well, I'd like John Wick's suit and I'd like it to be bulletproof, please. So you'll get 10 emails of them a day, every day, without fail, because we've done something that sort of sparks people's imagination. And so they then go, so our feedback, I think, will look quite wildly different to a lot of conventional clothing brands, because it will have the same normal stuff, size exchanges, zips, whatever it is, all the stuff that you have when you make physical things. But yeah, there is quite a lot of wish fulfillment where people ask us for the thing they've always wanted since they were 5 years old. As I say, whether it's, can you build the bat suit? That's it. It's well, not yet, but I'd like to.
And all of them gives me, you said the biomatic or biomimicry, when we have the hard and soft at the beginning, the fall is hard, the clothes soft. We try to combine the soft and hard in the design of the clothes, or maybe clothes that can shrink or change. That's something I'm curious if you think about these clothes shape morphing and adapting to your body or changing colors, or the kind of thing is, where do you see the next thing with the future of the clothes? Where do you see the thing that you may be interested in?
So I start with what are we going to need? because you can absolutely start with kind of color changing, probably possible. Shape shifting, that's gonna take a lot more time. But those sort of that they start with what could you do, and so my preference as a designer is always starting with, well, what are we going to need? And so a need doesn't have to be like a thing that we need immediately. It could be a thing that we consider ideal. So I tend to start with ideas where, just trying to think really carefully what I actually think about this, so to position it correctly. Ultimately, clothes are going to enhance us, right? So we are sacks of water and meat with electrical pulses running through us, and we die, or we think we die. Maybe something else happens, I don't know. But we have a limited lifespan. I think looking at the physical and sensory enhancement is a brilliant place that I'm really interested in, without turning us necessarily into robots instantly. There will be an acceleration of the journey that's essentially started with, let's say heart transplants, or, chips in your ears to help people hear, or chips in your brain to sort of prevent epilepsy, or whatever it is. I think enhancement is where we'll go. And I think there is a really, really clear role for the non-stop reading of data. For instance, as I said, we're just spitting off so much data, and our clothes are doing nothing about it, right? So even if you think about it as clothes as a receiver of that information, long term they'd probably be a processor of that information, and even longer term they'd probably be a delivery system that would mediate the issues that they've found. So you can almost think about it like a walking hospital, basically. Yeah. So I think that's where, because you have to look at where these things tend to go is where the money is, and that there'll be so much money going into people who are basically very wealthy going, oh, it's going to be really annoying if I die. I'd like to live a lot longer. So if you then think, well, kind of life extension is going to drive lots of this. This is probably going to be driven by life extension, biomedical, and military. And all of them will essentially be working on themes of enhancement in some way. So military will be enhanced physical performance. The biomedical will be sort of like enhanced diagnosis, enhanced medicine delivery, and the life extension people will be working on kind of enhance some kind of like cell process or whatever it is. But I think enhancement is where we're really going to go, and I think that will drive everything. The reason the question is complicated and not easy to answer in kind of like one sentence in a soundbite is because people tend to mistakenly think about the idea that there's going to be like one defining piece of clothing that does everything. And that's like thinking there's going to be one app in the App Store. There's not. There's going to be literally tens of thousands of things that need doing, driven by, political needs, socioeconomic needs, sort of like the needs of companies who want to deliver profits. And all of these competing forces are going to create functions within the future of clothing, all of which are this giant competing ecosystem in a big Petri dish. And so you really have to look at where innovation has been driven before, and that's likely to drive it again. So military and medical will probably drive this stuff, will drive large parts of it.
Impressive, yeah. I totally agree with your vision. Maybe the question, I don't know if I'd like answer it, but did you receive any criticism in this journey, like about what you do and how you deal with that?
Do we get criticism?
Exactly, yeah.
My children are very complimentary, certainly. The press have been quite nice. No, it doesn't tend to be something we face. I think that's more likely once you get to a certain type of scale. Um, I think there's always this thing is talked about in PR, which is no one ever tells the baby it's ugly. And so while you're still kind of small and learning, you don't really get a lot of finger pointing. It's only when you're sort of, you're a teenager, a brand that's a teenager, and you have spots, or you get old and you get corrupt, that then you tend to come into criticism. No, on the whole, what we tend to find is people and other companies, even competing companies, are actually very excited by what we do because it's just so novel. So no, that is, I have felt it. I do face challenges. I've faced health challenges. There's always you're always raising money. There's always issues. But no, not direct criticism of what we do, because we're just trying to do something quite interesting, and we're not really stepping on anyone's toes, because we're not trying to really compete with anyone that currently exists, I don't think.
Awesome. A final question: what thing do you want to achieve in your lifetime? Your mission in Vollebak, that the thing that you wish to see in your lifetime.
Oh, very simple. The first people to walk on Mars are wearing our stuff. That's it. Yeah, when whoever it is who has the fortune or misfortune to step out of that spaceship, I want them to be wearing our stuff. Yeah, that would be wild. As I think to be, yeah, the first clothing on another planet, just wild. Yeah, because the journey to get there will be crazy. As into the journey of how we become that. That would be it. That would be really wild.
I don't know if you have any final words like to say to people listening. Any final words like to say?
Well, your audience is in robotics, right? Yeah. So if anyone's working on anything crazy, I'd be very happy to chat to them. I like crazy stuff. I like joining dots of things that haven't been joined before.